Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this episode of 30 Minutes to President's Club. My name is Armand Farouk, and I'm here with my co-host, Nick Sigalski. And today, we have one of the, in fact, I believe, number one seller at Gong. His name is Brian LaManna. He is a senior mid-market account executive. He's done over 200% of his quota multiple times, has made 5 President's Clubs before the age of 27. Nick, why should people listen?
We got into a lot of unconventional things that Brian does in his deals. So one, we followed his deal cycle basically from start to finish, and he shared some unique stuff that he does. Everything from his technique called multi-single threading, which is a unique take on multi-threading, to introducing competitors in deal cycle, to not wanting to get to the highest rung of power as early as possible. So if you're looking for some unconventional things that Brian does to be at the top of the leaderboard, this one's a very good listen.
And 3, 2, 1, let's roll.
All right, Brian, welcome back to the show. You may recall that we start every episode with your top 3 actionable takeaways, so let's get your 3.
Yes, the first actionable tip, I'm calling it the risk is the way. It's your job as a seller to actually identify the number one reason why you will lose the deal and to call it out proactively and actually run towards that risk in your sales cycles or in your conversations. An example of what that risk might entail is that you're too low level with a prospect. Maybe you're at the manager or director level, but you have fear of going around them. Or 90% of your deals are competitive and you know you're 3 months in and they still haven't brought up any other competitors or looking into alternate solutions. Here's how I would go about it as one example. Say that our end of quarter is in 1 week from now and we still have yet to discuss security and legal. What I would do is write that out prior to my call with them. I would be forward at the very beginning of that conversation and say, hey, Armand, I'd be remiss not to remind you that next week is actually our end of quarter. And I know the team is really cognizant about pricing. We've yet to discuss legal or security yet. Is it cool if we carve out the last 10 minutes of today's conversation to talk through what that process entails? So if the team is able to move forward in quarter, we can make sure that's not a barrier.
Great. What's number 2?
My second actionable takeaway is to actually proactively introduce competitors. Most sellers are afraid of competitors within a sales cycle. What I've learned for me personally, the number one I lose deals is due to status quo or no decision. So I want to bring them up proactively and do it in a really tasteful manner. A couple of the ways I'll introduce it is a second, third, fourth call in, and I'll mention something like, hey, pretend you don't go with us. How do you plan on solving for that number one priority of growing your win rates? Or is this a big enough problem that we've identified so far that we're willing to invest money in fixing it? The third question I might ask as well is buyers who evaluate us, they'll typically look at 2 to 3 other options as well. Have you all begun that process yet?
Nice. Round us out. What's number 3?
My third actionable takeaway is multi-single threading. We all know that multi-threading is important and the more champions we can build, the better. What I've learned personally with my stats at Gong, when I only have 1 contact engaged, my win rate is 3%. And when my win rate is 4+ stakeholders, it's actually above 50%. At some point during the sales cycle, I'm often able to get a group presentation or a group demo. But oftentimes what would happen prior is that I would run that big demo with 5 or 10 people on the other end. And then after that call takes place, I'm siloed back to only dealing with my champion or that one decision maker. So what I've done is implemented this process called multi-single threading that I do after every large group presentation. The first thing I do is I make sure that initial meeting was actually recorded. The second thing I do is following that meeting, I'll send a same-day follow-up to the entire team on one thread. And then here's where the multi-single threading comes into place. I'll review that call and I'll take short notes on each person. I'll write down different questions that each person asked and little comments that they made. And then the day following the presentation, I'll actually send one note to each individual stakeholder as a follow-up and make sure I'm adding value to them without making any asks on their end.
Alrighty, Brian, I want to come back to that big group presentation. Before we do that, could you just orient everyone who's listening? What are the big steps or stages in your sales cycle leading up to that big group meeting?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first stage is typically going to be a discovery call. It's usually around 30 minutes where I'm going to start to learn a little bit about their business, share a little bit about Gong, and maybe show them like one screen within platform. The second stage is going to be a demo, typically with that same stakeholder. And then from there, I'm starting to get wider and asking my main point of contact who else needs to be involved in that cycle, even making recommendations on who would typically be involved in a sales cycle based on folks that evaluate Gong. So typically around the third or fourth step in the sales process.
I actually want to go back to step 2 in the sales cycle, where you're doing a discovery call and then you're doing a one-to-one demo with that same stakeholder. And I assume that you have the right champion. Maybe it's a director or just below VP type of persona. Oftentimes in sales, we're told to get access to power as early as possible. Can you talk about why you're not trying to pull 3 or 4 people into that second demo, even though you had a successful discovery call?
Yeah, for me, it's really important to make sure first and foremost that I can build that initial person into a champion or at least like a strong mobilizer. What that means for me is I want to make sure that they're bought into how they're going to get value from it to their persona in particular. And then instead of just immediately trying to go to power, I just want to go one step above that individual. Think about your sales organization as an example. It'd be a really big ask to get your sales manager to take you to, say, the CRO as a next step. I want to just go one level up on that ladder because you're often going to fall off the ladder if you try to go too many steps at a time and kind of skip some pieces. So if I'm at the manager level as an example, I'm going to make the ask, hey, I saw Brian is actually your director. I think he'd be a really great individual to get his unique perspective in addition to yours if you're excited about what today.
Yeah, one of the clients that I was doing some founder-led sales consulting for, he was really excited about this concept of winning deals at power as early as possible. So he would always get a first discovery call. And then at the second call, he would always ask for the CEO to join the call. But the problem is the champion wasn't bought in yet. And so the champion wasn't actually in the room advocating on their behalf. The champion was still evaluating his solution. And at the same time, that's happening while the CEO is just getting introduced to the solution as well. And so you want to wait until you're on the same side before you get that high in your sales cycle.
Brian, I want to ask you about, let's say you're meeting with a sales director, and it sounds like you're showing them how they get value from the solution. But my guess is a sales director could sit through 12 demos from Gong, and they still wouldn't understand every single thing that Gong could do for them. And I would actually say that it's probably a risk if you spend too much time with the director level contact and haven't gotten to some other people. And so can you talk about how you introduce the concept of, hey, Armand, like I love showing you these demos, but we probably need to get a couple other people involved. How do you say that to your prospect?
Yeah, for me, it all starts with the pre-call preparation. So I'm going to actually look into that organization, pull up LinkedIn, try to map out likely who they report to, at least come up with a couple different names. Why I do that is I want to insert that then into the upfront contract of the conversation and say something like, hey, Nick, if today does go well, it'd be really important to get Jim's perspective in addition to yours. Does that sound like a fair next step? And then at the end of the call, I'm going to make that recommendation. I'll probably start lightly with asking for feedback. Hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how compelling was Gong today for your role as director of sales? What would have made it a 10? Are you open to a recommendation? And then I'm going to make that strong prescription at the very end, recommending that we get your boss as well into a call to get both of your perspective on how this can help whatever that number one initiative was that they laid out.
Well, it's really smart when you introduce that ask for power up front in the beginning. Because what you're not doing is in the last 3 minutes of the meeting being like, by the way, we need to get this in front of Jim now. And the customers, wait, what, huh? When you introduce it up front and assuming they agree with it, now they have the entire meeting and they know at the end you're going to ask for the introduction to their boss. And what they're going to do is they're actually going to scrutinize your solution a little bit more. They're going to pay a little more attention. They're going to ask more questions because they know at the end you're going to make that ask to get to power. But then also when you, in that upfront contract, say, hey, we probably need to get this in front of Jim next, if they strongly disagree with that, Well, now you have an opportunity to talk with them about that, and it's not a surprise anymore, and you can actually have a conversation around, and so it's really smart that you do it up front.
I'd put yourself in like your own shoes as an AE. Could you get your manager to a call if you really needed to that was like a sales call of you evaluating a solution? Like, sure you could, but you would have to be so bought in and you would have to trust that sales rep. You'd have to know that they're the ultimate professional. You'd have to feel like, man, this solution would really help us to be able to want to put your equity on the line. I think about it the same way for my prospects. Like, they can always get you to power, but it's on you to showcase that you're prepared, you're asking good discovery questions, you're truly hitting all of their needs and their requirements. So it's really about that process from start to finish of pre-call prep, upfront contract, nailing the demo or discovery call, and then making that prescription strong at the end. And if you've done everything right up until that point, you'll get that result you want more times than not.
So end of the second call, let's say that you've won over the manager and the director. Now, what does the wrap up look like for that call?
Yeah, similar process. I'm going to continue to work up the ladder in essence. So if it's like manager first, then director, then VP, then C-suite, I'm going to keep trying to go up the ladder only one step at a time. So if I just got the manager and the director bought in, both of them are super excited. Well, I'm going to find out that VP's name. We'll pretend like her name's Karen. I'm going to include that in the upfront contract. I'm going to prescribe that as a recommendation at the end of the call. And we're going to hopefully put together a demo with the three of us. Maybe I'll level up at that point as well and bring in my sales leader and set up some time between then the five of us.
What do you do when folks want to get too wide in a sales cycle too early? I imagine that, let's say, for example, you're meeting with the director of mid-market sales, and they're like, sure, we can have our VP, but also director of SMB, director of enterprise, director of strategic, director of international. We got to win all of these other departmental leads on board. How do you prevent yourself from doing like that super wide big team presentation?
Yeah, at that point, I'd probably want to run more discovery and start with more of the end in mind of like, where are we trying to get to? So with Gong, we'll oftentimes run pilots or proof of concepts as a really great way to de-risk the investment, prove out the value, and get them on that path to partnership and purchase. So I might ask in that case, hey, prior to something like a pilot, would we need all of those 10 stakeholders or individuals bought in to a solution like Gong? Or alternatively, is that something that maybe we could accomplish during the pilot where instead of just showing them demo data, we could show them real data with their calls, with their deals, with their conversations to make it even more impactful. So it's going to come back to discovery and just really understanding what the buying process looks like on their end and who all needs to be involved.
All right, Brian, I want to ask you about this concept of multi-single threading, because what it sounds like you're doing is you have a big team meeting and there's, 4, 5, 6 different people on this meeting. And what I know most salespeople do is they're going to follow up with all of those people. After the meeting, they send one recap email to the entire group. And that is their definition of now I'm multi-threaded. You're doing it a little bit differently. And so can you explain how your approach differs with multi-single threading?
Yeah, and imagine you do send that email to the 7 individuals on the call in that group email. What I found is you're not going to get a response. It's going to fall on deaf ears. You're going to then go back to just working with your main POC or your champion or decision maker, whoever that entails. And you might never hear from those other 5 or 6 individuals again. My goal is to keep them fully engaged throughout the rest of the evaluation, the rest of the sales process, to not only get wide, but stay wide. So how I do that is I'm sending those one-to-one emails the following day after that group email. And really what I'm doing is I'm just opening up the door with Armand, with Nick, with Karen, with Jennifer. I'm going to add value in some way to them. So maybe an example of what that looks like is I'll say, hey, Armand, re-listen to our demo. And I heard you ask about what our Salesforce integration looks like within CRM. I made this 1-minute video walkthrough of it, insert video. Let me know if this prompts any questions. I'm not giving them homework. I'm really just showing them, hey, I'm doing the homework. I'm re-listening to our call. I'm adding value. More times than not, Armand's going to respond to me and say, thanks, this was super helpful. He's going to watch the video, something else. And then 2-3 weeks later in the sales process, maybe I have a different ask from him to spend one-on-one time together, or I'm asking him to champion it as well. And I've really led the engagement with value rather than making an ask from him.
One of the things our customers at Pave would always tell us is when I would send an individualized follow-up, or when I would have our CEO Matt send a follow-up, it would create this halo effect around the type of company we were and the type of service that they were going to get post-sale. They're like, if their sales team is this all over it, all over the deals, I have to imagine their engineers are this good. I have to imagine that their implementation team is this good. Versus if you've ever bought something and you're like, that salesperson sucked, you just assume that the rest of the company is also materially more crappy, even if it was just a bad rep in that situation. So Brian, I want to talk about other touch points with these multi-stakeholders. So you have the manager, you have the director, and you have the VP. You send these individualized emails. How do you maintain touch points with each of those people after this email? Or do you have any desire to?
I definitely do. My goal is to get out at least one touch on a weekly basis to any stakeholder that I'm actively engaged with. It could be as small as adding them on LinkedIn. It could be sending them an article. It could be sending them a short video walkthrough. But my goal is to continue to keep their active engagement throughout the process until I can get to whatever desired next step looks like in terms of the evaluation of something that maybe forces their involvement a little bit more, like them trialing the solution or having more hands-on experience.
How do you actually systematize or manage this, Brian? Because if I'm thinking about 5 or 6 different stakeholders across 20, 25, 30 deals that I assume you're working, that's a lot of touch points every single week. And so do you have a process to stay on top of that stuff?
It is a lot of touch points. It's definitely worth the time and effort, I'll say, to maximize each and every deal. My process to systematize it is the first thing I do every single morning is I actually review my active pipeline. I pull it up within Gong. You can pull it up within Salesforce as well if you prefer that view. But I go one by one through my opportunities, and I just spend maybe 15-20 minutes strategizing on any plays or touch points that I want to get out for that day. So I'm going to think through each opportunity and say, hey, Acme Corp, my next meeting isn't until next Tuesday with these 3 people. What can I do today on this Tuesday to advance that deal in any way? Could I add them on LinkedIn? Could I send them a short video? Could I get some different touch point out? So I'm just trying to make sure that I'll never go 2 meetings without getting at least one touch point out between them.
Brian, I want to go back one more step into that big team meeting because we didn't really talk about what you're doing in that. You had the manager on board, you got the director on board, and now you need to get this VP on board. But I think one thing that's overlooked is this is like the 3rd time the manager has seen this presentation too. Are you just okay repeating the same information over and over again to the same person? Or how do you get information from the new VP to be won over without fatiguing the manager?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think from like our lens as sellers, it sounds repetitive because we're the ones saying these talk tracks every day and demoing the same areas of the platform. But think about the first time you stepped into your role at your SaaS company and opened up your platform. It probably felt overwhelming. You didn't learn everything the first time you saw it. So I actually think it's a good thing. I think 3 times is like when it starts to really stick in terms of like your value proposition, your narrative, exactly which areas of the platform they would be leveraging related to their initiatives. I think the main way that I'm not fatiguing that manager is I'm not going to continue to run discovery with them in the 3rd call of once I have that VP on board. I'm more going to use quotes that they shared and say, hey, the manager, Matt, shared that our launch in APAC is one of our biggest initiatives. I'm curious, VP, from your lens, is that the number 1 priority you're focused on now through end of year, or does anything trump that? So I'm going to more reference our conversations, but then run discovery with a newer person in the room, which will typically be the highest up person if I'm continuing to work my way up that ladder.
If you've ever seen those movies where it's like Revenge of the Blob, your sales cycle is like this big green blob. And at the beginning, like the blob is really small and there's not much in it. And Honestly, if someone just stepped on the blob, it would probably be smashed into smithereens. But then eventually you start to roll along and you get a manager involved in the blob, and the manager tells you all these problems around the org. And then you roll again and you get the director, and the director adds like one or two more problems. And by the time you get to the VP, you don't have to recreate the entire blob from scratch. That would be what most sellers do, which is doing discovery from complete scratch all over again. You basically want to say, here's what's already inside of this blob. What do you have to add to this blob? And that allows you to do discovery in 10 or 15 minutes, as opposed to doing another 30-minute discovery call. And it keeps discovery fresh because you're only focused on adding the new perspectives or underlining the existing ones, not just repeating the exact same information you were already getting before. So Brian, after you've won over this VP, right, now you have your manager, director, and VP, and let's assume that there's no CRO in this case to avoid complication. What are you doing at the end of this meeting? What's the final step after the big group presentation?
So once I'm at that level with the VP, the director, and the manager, and that's the end step, what I'm going to share in the beginning of the call is an upfront contract to say, hey, Mrs. VP, if today's call does go well, I'd love to set some time aside to actually talk through what our pilot process entails, as that's how most folks end up evaluating Gong. Or if alternatively, if it doesn't make sense today or it's not a fit, we can always part ways as friends. And then towards the end of the call, again, I'm going to understand her feedback, understand what would have made it a 10 out of 10 through her perspective, and then make the recommendation for a next step of, hey, I'd love to chat through what our pilot process entails start to finish, how other organizations have ran them successfully. Can we carve out 30 minutes tomorrow to talk through that? In addition to the director and manager as well to be a part of that conversation. So I'm going to launch that into a separate step just so I can listen to what happened during that demo, come to that conversation really prepared to talk through the pilot, commercials, any next steps, things like that.
I've had a bunch of customers ask for pilots before they were willing to give us access to power. How do you talk a customer off of that?
It happens really frequently with us as well, where maybe that like manager level is asking, hey, I'd love to pilot this. What would it take? I'll typically just reverse it and turn around to them and say, hey, pilots are something we offer. Typically, it's the last step before ultimately moving forward. Curious from your perspective, if that pilot did go well, would you have approval and sign off? What would that look like? I'm really just reversing it and turning it on them to start to realize that they don't really have executive alignment yet. We haven't yet gone through commercials. They're not in a place for signature yet. So I'm going to ask that question first to diffuse it. And then from there, I'm going to make a recommendation, share, hey, prior to actually starting a pilot, I think it would be really important. I know we've yet to get director involved, VP involved. In terms of a next step, let's make sure that both of them are excited about what's in it for them. What do you think about setting up a demo with director next week? And we can also chat through what that pilot process looks like a little bit more.
My natural curiosity wants to ask about there are free or really cheap versions of stuff that like does what Gong does. And I think you're one of the more expensive solutions on the market. And so I'm curious, like, how do you handle that early in the sales process so that you don't get disqualified because you're more expensive than a lot of your competitors?
Yeah, it's the best problem and the worst problem, right? Is the best problem is I've been at Gong for a little over 3 years and I've yet to lose a deal because someone said we truly prefer this other solution's capabilities or features better. But the bad part is that, yes, we are more expensive and we will get undercut on price and sometimes lose. And I think that's natural and I think that's good for markets as well. What my approach is, knowing that, and it gets back to that concept earlier, like the risk is the way, is knowing that we're the premium offering. It makes discovery and actually quantifying ROI that much more important. It's one of the first things I want to do in my sales process and in discovery is understand their number one initiative and what it's ultimately worth. So just as an example, say they're launching a brand new product for the first time and their goal is to close $5 million of revenue through end of year. All of a sudden, if Gong is $100,000 and our next competitor is $50,000, that 50K gap doesn't feel quite as meaningful when they're after that $5 million target where their entire company is pivoting around this new offering and new solution. So it's really getting back to core ROI and then differentiating your platform off of how you're the only solution that can truly help for, say, that new product launch in this example.
So it sounds like you want to get to a point where you're establishing business impact, some ROI before you're covering pricing, but then there's also this pilot motion involved. Are you covering pricing before the pilot happens to make sure that they have the ability to pay for this type of thing?
Yeah, I think it's super important to always introduce pricing pretty early on. I'll always have introduced at least a range by the end of the second call. Typically what I'll do is I'll just ask for like how many total users would be in go-to-market that are customer facing. And I'll provide them with a little bit of a range of saying, hey, it does depend on a couple of factors, but say for 40 users, you're looking at $50,000 to $70,000. I'll pause, deliver it with confidence. I'll oftentimes share a pricing sheet after. That's our official pricing sheet. If there is any negotiation that tries to happen beforehand, we try to stray away from it just because at the end of the day, I want to make sure that they're bought into the value first and foremost before we go down the pricing route and talk through all the different levers we have between term length and number of users and billing and things like that.
When you send that follow-up email with the pricing sheet, is there other context that you are including around the value, the problems Gong solves, etc.? My mind is going to, that is probably going to get forwarded to people you haven't talked to yet. And I'm curious if you're doing anything special to make sure that it's like value plus price.
I always want to make sure I have some form of understanding of their number one priority as well as the ROI they're going after before I share that range for pricing or that pricing sheet. Good news is I often do that in the first call, if not the very beginning of the second call. And then I am going to include that in the email as well. In that recap, I'm always trying to outline not about the features and solution set that they saw in the demo and outlining why we're different. I try to make those recap emails all about them. Hey, today we're launching a brand new product. Bullet number 1. Number 2, our goal through end of year is to close $5 million in revenue. Bullet number 3, the biggest challenge in that is making sure we're positioning it right versus competitors. So it's all about them. And then when I include that pricing sheet, it has a little bit of context off of the initiatives that they're really driving towards.
So Brian, I want to go back to when a customer tries to negotiate, you try to delay the negotiation because you're not sure if they're even bought into your solution yet. How do you say that to a prospect?
Yeah, so for us, my goal is to make sure, like you mentioned, that they're fully bought into the value of the platform. If it's a 1-year agreement or a 3-year agreement, if they do this just with account executives or all of go-to-market. So it's really difficult to talk pricing before they know who it actually makes sense for. So typically the way I'm going to actually tell them that is just by asking them questions of, hey, how many users ultimately would you want to move forward with? Is the team comfortable with a 3-year agreement? Typically, when we go down the path of negotiation, my team's going to want to ask for me is, hey, is this the last step before they're ready for signature? So again, it's trying to have them come up with the realization that we're not yet at that point of negotiation. At the end of the day, if they share something like, hey, this pricing is just too high to move on and continue the evaluation or pilot the technology in the first place, what I want to do is just give them my commitment. So I'll often share something like, hey, everything I've shared is our approved pricing. You have my commitment that if the team sees value in this and wants to move forward, we will work with you all on commercials to make sure it's a huge win for you all as well.
Brian, we are running out of time. We got to move to the final question, which is this. We've talked about great things salespeople should be doing. Now I got to ask you about a shouldn't. And so the last question is, what is one bad habit that you see a lot of salespeople exhibiting that you think they need to break because it hurts them more than it helps?
Discounting as a crutch to not running strong discovery or putting together a compelling business case. It's not going to help you get the deal across the finish line if you haven't done proper discovery, understanding ROI, and understanding the cost of inaction if that initiative ultimately doesn't pan out.
Amazing. Brian, thank you for joining us. Everybody stick around for a 60-second recap coming up soon.
All right, Nick, time for a 2x2 recap from this episode with Brian LaManna. What do you have for your 2?
So number one is to multi-single thread. So when you have a big team meeting with 4 or 5 different stakeholders, of course you should still send the big team recap email to everybody, but then the next day send one-to-one messages to each of the stakeholders that you want to develop a relationship with. And this is usually just a value add, no ask touch as a way to establish a line of connection with those people so that you can go back to them if you need to later in the deal cycle. Number 2 is the daily pipeline exercise that Brian follows. So every day what Brian does is he looks at the deals in his pipeline and he thinks, what can I do today to help give myself a better chance at winning this deal? And that's how he manages all of the different touch points he has, the different stakeholders, and finds ways to add value every single day to every single op.
Number 3, win one stakeholder at a time. The discovery call, you're winning the manager. The demo call, you're winning the director. That big team meeting, you're winning over the VP. Build on one person at a time. Don't take them all on at once. And then lastly, number 4, the steps in Brian's sales cycle were as follows. Discovery, then a demo, then a big team demo, and then a pilot. And then from there, he's going into the commercial negotiation. Alrighty, Nick, how can people help us out here?
So we recently partnered with Brian and had him document some of his favorite discovery questions on the 30MPC newsletter. And Brian authored a piece called The 8 Discovery Questions That Got Him to President's Club. If you want to check it out, it's free. There's a link in the show notes. He's got some really good stuff in there. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week on the show.